In March 2022, 400 commercial airliners were stolen in the space of a single week, and not one of them moved an inch. No masked hijackers, no forged bills of sale, no midnight ferry flights to hidden airstrips. 400 jets worth roughly $10 billion, owned by leasing companies half a world away, simply changed hands while the world watched. Russia called it re-registration. The leasing industry called it the largest asset seizure in the history of commercial aviation. And here is the part that makes this story genuinely strange. The heist was legal. On paper, every step of it followed the law. This is the story of the $10 billion plane heist nobody went to jail for, and why the people who ended up paying for it were not Russian at all. Because 4 years later, the stolen fleet is doing something no one predicted. It is quietly eating itself alive. To understand how you steal 400 airliners with a signature, you need to understand a secret about the airline industry that most passengers never think about. The airlines do not own the planes. Roughly half of all commercial jets on Earth belong to leasing companies, and the capital of that empire is not Seattle or Toulouse, it is Dublin, Ireland. Thanks to decades of favorable tax law, a city of 500,000 people controls trillions of dollars of flying metal. Companies like AerCap, the largest aircraft lessor in the world, buy jets by the hundreds and rent them to airlines by the month, the same way a landlord rents apartments. For 30 years, Russia was a dream tenant. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian carriers dumped their aging Tupolevs and filled their fleets with leased Western aircraft. By early 2022, Russian airlines were flying roughly 780 jets, and more than 500 of them belonged to foreign lessors. Aeroflot, the proud flag carrier of the Russian Federation, was essentially flying someone else's property from Dublin. The rent checks arrived on time, the relationship worked, and then, on February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and every one of those lease agreements became a ticking bomb. Here is the mechanism that turned a war into a heist. Within days of the invasion, the European Union passed sanctions with a very specific clause buried inside. Every lease of every aircraft to a Russian airline had to be terminated by March 28, 2022. Put simply, the landlords were legally ordered to evict their own tenants and take their property back within about a month. 500 jets, scattered across 11 time zones, repossessed in 30 days. It was impossible, and everyone knew it was impossible. Repossession teams scrambled anyway. Lessors snatched a handful of jets that happened to be sitting in Istanbul, Dubai, and Cairo, grabbing them the moment they touched down outside Russian airspace. Russian airlines noticed, and almost overnight, their international flights stopped. The planes retreated inside Russia's borders like a fist closing. Then Moscow made its move. On March 14th, 2022, the Kremlin signed a law allowing Russian airlines to re-register foreign-owned aircraft on Russia's own national registry. Days earlier, Russian legislation had already banned the export of aircraft and aviation equipment out of the country. 2 documents, a few signatures, and 400 airliners belonging to foreign companies were now, under Russian law, Russian planes that could never leave. To grasp why this was so devastating, you need to know about one of aviation's oldest rules. The Chicago Convention of 1944, the treaty that governs global aviation, says every aircraft on Earth can be registered in exactly one country. One plane, one flag, one set of safety inspectors. Most of the leased Russian fleet was registered in Bermuda or Ireland, and when those regulators suspended the airworthiness certificates in protest, Russia simply ignored them and issued its own. The industry has a name for what happened next: ghost registrations. Hundreds of aircraft now carried 2 identities at once, legal in Moscow, stolen everywhere else. A ghost-registered jet is trapped in a kind of legal purgatory. Fly it to almost any foreign airport, and the original owner can have it impounded on the tarmac. So the stolen fleet did the only thing it could do. It vanished into Russia's domestic network, shuttling between Moscow and Vladivostok, $10 billion of assets flying in circles inside the world's largest cage. So, the heist worked. Russia kept the planes, kept its domestic aviation network alive, and no repo team on Earth could touch the fleet. Case closed, you would think. But that was just the opening move, because the real war over these 400 aircraft was never going to be fought in Moscow. It was fought in courtrooms in London and Dublin between companies you would never expect. And this is where the story inverts completely. The lessors could not sue Russia in any meaningful way, but every one of those jets was insured, and the policies had been written and reinsured in the London insurance market, the same market that has priced global catastrophe since coffeehouse merchants insured sailing ships 3 centuries ago. So the leasing companies turned around and pointed at their own insurers. AerCap alone filed claims running into the billions. AIG Chubb, Swiss Re, the Lloyd's of London syndicates. The bill for Russia's seizure landed on the desks of Western insurance executives, and they did what insurance companies do when someone hands them a $10 billion invoice. They refused to pay. Their argument was almost elegant. The war risk policies covered theft and government seizure, but had the planes actually been stolen, they were still flying, still maintained, still carrying passengers to Sochi every morning. Maybe, the insurers argued, they might even come back someday. You cannot pay out a total loss on an aircraft that takes off on schedule. That single question, are the planes actually lost, produced one of the largest insurance trials in history. 6 sets of claims were fused into a single mega-trial at the High Court in London, 5 months of testimony deciding the fate of 147 aircraft carrying $4.5 billion in claims. And while the lawyers argued, something stranger was happening off the record. Russia started paying, not because a court forced it to, but because Moscow wanted clean title to what it had taken. A Russian state insurance entity called NSK, funded by the Kremlin with roughly $3 billion, began quietly buying the stolen planes from their original owners. AerCap took $645 million for 17 jets that had flown for Aeroflot, then came back for a second deal covering 47 more. Other lessors followed, and settlement by settlement, about 100 aircraft were converted from stolen property into legally purchased Russian assets, often at a fraction of their real value. The thief returned to the victims years later and negotiated a discount on the things it had already taken. And the victims said yes, because a discounted payment beats a courtroom promise. Then, on June 11, 2025, the London judgment finally landed, 230 pages that redrew the map of aviation insurance. The court ruled that the aircraft were permanently lost, and it even fixed the date of death, March 10, 2022, the day Russia banned their export. The war risk insurers, not the all-risk insurers, were on the hook, and AerCap alone was awarded more than $1 billion before interest. Add the Russian settlements and the parallel cases still grinding through courts in Ireland and the United States, and the pattern becomes undeniable. The largest heist in aviation history has largely been paid for by the London insurance market and its global reinsurers, which means the cost is now flowing outward into higher war risk premiums on every airline, every route, every ticket. Russia took the planes. The West's own financial system absorbed the bill. But while the lawyers were counting their billions, the actual loot was undergoing a transformation nobody at the Kremlin likes to talk about. Because here is the fatal flaw in stealing an airliner. A modern jet is not really a machine you own. It is a subscription you maintain. Every component, from the engines to the coffee makers, lives on a certified maintenance schedule backed by manufacturers, approved parts, and licensed engineers. Boeing and Airbus cut Russia off completely in 2022. No parts, no software updates, no documentation. It is the equivalent of stealing a Ferrari from a dealership, then discovering that every spare part, every diagnostic computer, and every qualified mechanic on Earth belongs to the dealership you just robbed. The car still sits in your driveway. It still starts, and every single day it runs a little worse. Russia's answer has a name that sounds like something from a horror film because it essentially is: cannibalization. In 2023, Russian authorities formally legalized stripping aircraft for parts. Working jets are designated as donors, towed to hangars, and dismembered so their organs can keep sister aircraft alive. By late 2025, Ukrainian intelligence assessed that more than a third of Russia's civil fleet had already been cannibalized. Aeroflot even arranged to acquire 8 Boeing cargo jets in a deal worth around $130 million for the sole purpose of tearing them apart. Those aircraft will never fly again. They exist purely as spare parts with wings. And this is where the story stops being about money, because tomorrow morning somewhere in Russia, a family will board one of these jets for a domestic flight. The cabin will look normal, the crew will sound normal. What those passengers cannot see is what is holding the aircraft together. Components that trickled in through shadow networks in third countries, often with paperwork nobody can verify. Repairs performed by shops no Western regulator has ever inspected. Parts pulled from a sister ship that was towed into a hangar and taken apart last month. The consequences are already showing up in the data. Engine failures climbing, incident reports multiplying year over year. Russian officials themselves now admit that more than 100 foreign-built jets could leave service by 2030, and independent estimates suggest the Western-built fleet could shrink by half. The stolen aircraft cannot leave Russia without being impounded, cannot be legally maintained inside Russia, and cannot be replaced because no manufacturer will sell Russia so much as a landing light. The 400 planes that Moscow captured in March 2022 are not assets anymore. They are hostages on a slow-drip death sentence, flying passengers today on borrowed parts from planes that died yesterday. So return to that week in March 2022, when $10 billion changed hands without a single aircraft moving. 4 years later, every party in this story has settled into its verdict. The lessors were made whole, or close to it, by courtrooms and settlements. The insurers absorbed billions and passed the pain into premiums that every flyer on Earth now quietly funds. Russia kept its fleet flying, at the cost of turning its own aviation system into an organ farm that consumes itself a little more every month. And the planes, the actual objects at the center of the largest heist in aviation history, are becoming worthless in the one place they are allowed to exist. Nobody went to jail because no law that any court could enforce was ever quite broken in a way that attached to a human being. It was a crime committed by legislation, prosecuted through insurance policies, and punished by physics. Here is the lesson buried in all that aluminum. You can steal an airplane with a signature. What you cannot steal is the invisible machine that keeps it alive, the parts, the engineers, the certifications, the global web of trust that turns 300 tons of metal into a safe way to cross a continent. Russia captured the hardware and lost the ecosystem, and in modern aviation, the ecosystem was always the thing that was actually worth $10 billion. In the end, the perfect heist is not the one where nobody catches you. It is the one where the loot slowly destroys itself before anyone can take it back. If you were running one of those leasing companies in 2022, would you have taken Russia's discounted settlement money for your own stolen planes, or held out on principle and let them rot? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more stories about aviation's biggest gambles, greatest escapes, and most expensive mistakes, hit subscribe.